I'd like to move on to your book War Games, published in 2008. Could you please explain the main thesis of that work?
I'm not even sure if it has a thesis, you know. I tend to say, look, I'm a journalist. I go to a place, I see something, I write it down, and then I present it and I say, hey, you have a problem, solve it, you know.
So what did you find? What did you present?
What did I find? I went to places where I saw what I became to call the aid industry, the crisis caravan move in post-war situations especially. Large refugee situations, so not so much natural disasters where you find the crisis caravan too, but I went into places where there was a post-war situation, and what I found, what I studied, the flow of the money. I found that the international aid industry in general has $130 billion per year to spend. I believe that's a lot of money. Not all of that goes to humanitarian aid, obviously, but that's the aid industry, you know, $130 billion per year. Then the UN once they tried to count how many international aid organizations there are to help spend the 130 billion, and they stopped counting at 37,000. So you are looking at a lot of money and a lot of organizations and a lot of donors. You have about 70 donor countries, of which Holland is one, but the United States is one, and the United Kingdom is a donor country. So you have very large donor countries and a lot of very, very small donor countries. So $130 billion, 70 donor governments, at least 37,000 aid organizations. It's a huge industry with a lot of political agendas, military agendas, diplomatic agendas. So it's an industry, and they have their agendas, meaning that the choices that donor countries make of where to send their aid money to is political. It has very little to do with who needs aid the most. And that is the reputation that it has. You know, aid is there to help the most needy in this world. Only 25% of all the aid money goes to the poorest people on the planet. The rest goes to places where the donor countries have military, political, and diplomatic agendas. So that means that these days the vast majority of all the aid funds go to countries that are involved in the war on terror. It is frontline states in the war on terror. It is our allies in the war on terror, places like Ethiopia and Somalia and Iraq and Afghanistan. They get the bulk of the aid money, not based on needs but based on politics. So this is what bothered me about the aid industry, that it is so political, that the majority of the people who are in need don't see any of that money. And I believed it was important to tell that story because in the end the aid industry operates on our money, we, the civilians. It is our tax money. It is our money that we take out of our pockets. This is what pays for the aid industry. And I believe it is important for us to take responsibility for that money, to know where that money is being spent and why. We should be aware of the choices that politics and the military make about aid money, because aid is our foreign policy instrument. It goes to our allies. But at the same time, aid is also an instrument for the people that receive it. I mean, the Ethiopian government, who is a very, very large aid recipient, the Ethiopian government does not spend it on all Ethiopians equally who. They spend it on who is supportive of the Ethiopian government. The Somali government, who is another very big recipient, doesn't spend it on all the Somalians who are in need. No, they spend it on a certain part of the population, and they deny it to another part of the population. So it's an instrument for everybody, for the ones who give the aid and for the ones who receive the aid.
And also in your book, I think you pointed out to some of the unintended negative consequences of humanitarian aid. So, for example, I think the opening anecdote is from the Congo, where Interamwe are also in the refugee camps and sort of gain strength
Yeah.
to attack again.
Yeah, it is. One of the secrets that the aid industry likes to keep is that refugee camps, and we have millions of refugees, and we have enormous refugee camps around the world, in Africa, but also in Syria, and also around Somalia and Ethiopia. Millions of people live in refugee camps, and it's a sort of secret that the aid industry does not really want to share with us, is that the people living in those refugee camps are almost normal people, you know. They are refugees from a war, and they bring their war with them to inside those refugee camps. And it is not the international aid organizations who have the power inside the camps. It's the camp authorities who have the power. The camp authorities who decide who gets the aid inside the camp and who doesn't get the aid inside the camp. It's the local authorities who, if they find it necessary, will tax aid organizations for permission to work inside those camps. So aid inside refugee camps is an enormous instrument, and it can be an instrument of war. Aid represents a value. Food aid represents a value, it represents power. So if you are in charge of a camp, you are in charge of millions of dollars per day. So it's an important instrument to control, and this is what happens inside those refugee camps.
And can you give a concrete example of how maybe in a refugee camp that you visited you saw that aid was being used in a negative way?
Yeah, the first time that became painfully clear, not shared with the rest of the world, but it became painfully clear for the aid industry that aid is a powerful instrument inside a war situation, inside a refugee camp, was in Rwanda in 1994 and 1995. The enormous amount of Rwandan refugees that fled Rwanda, they came over the mountains of Rwanda, and they came down on the Zairean side of the mountains, and they settled in a place called Goma. And enormous refugee camps were there. In total, about 2 million Rwandans fled, and about 1 million of them ended up in and around Goma. And an enormous amount of aid went to those camps. Aid organizations came, money came, you know. And I was there in 1994 and 1995. And what actually happened is that the entire extremist Hutu government had settled in those camps. The entire Hutu army that had actually committed the genocide in Rwanda had settled in those camps, plus the Hutu extremists who had helped the army to perform the genocide in Rwanda. The newspaper readers inside Europe and inside America only thought in terms of victims. They saw victims on TV. They saw people who were in need of help. Aid organizations knew who the refugees were actually, the Hutu extremists, but they didn't share that knowledge with us. So a lot of money went into the Hutu extremist movement, and they used it. They used it to get their own strength back. They used it to regroup militarily, and they used it to continue their genocidal campaign inside Rwanda. So this was a very clear example of how aid can be a weapon of war in a very direct way. But in every refugee camp where war refugees are, you will find this. This is the story of refugee camps around Somalia. It is the story of refugee camps in Syria at the moment. So this is part of what humanitarian aid is. It is a problem that is inherent with humanitarian aid.